Aloha mai kākou. This is Kapalikū, culture educator here at the BishopMuseum, and welcome to another edition of WāKahikoWednesdays. Today, we'll be looking at something quite basic, but really necessary to the creation of anything in the universe of our kupuna, our ancestors here in Hawaii, and in other parts of the Pacific. And that basic element is what we call aho, or kaula, cordage. Here at the BishopMuseum, we have lots of different examples of native fibers used in the making of cordage. And cordage is a very important aspect of life if you come from a society that does not use nails or glue or other kinds of ways to adhere two surfaces together. In fact, most of Hawaiian culture is built around the idea that when you put things together, you're going to be using cordage and rope. So we have some examples of those things right here in our aho case. But not only do we have examples of the material, which we'll talk about today, we're also going to be looking at the ways that we process the material and how we get to that point with very specialized tools. To begin, I'd like to point out the different kinds, both in terms of color and shape, of cordage and tools that are used in the manufacture of cordage. Now in Hawaiian culture, and in many Pacific Island cultures, the cordage that is made does not come from animals, it comes from plant materials. Fibers that are grown and tested for their strength over hundreds of years. Some of the most common fibers that we have in the Pacific include different kinds of hibiscus, among which we also have a plant called hau here in Hawaii and in other parts of the Pacific. We also have a plant called niu, which in English is the coconut. And in many other parts of the Pacific, that rope, which is made from the niu, from the coconut, is called aha, or afa, or kafa. And it's very, very strong and very waterproof. And we can see already, you might be able to guess some of the very special uses for a waterproof cordage, especially when we're surrounded by salt water. But to begin the process, quite literally, of creating cordage, we have specialized tools that help us do that. Here in the case, we have some large pieces of lao, large pieces of wood, which are boards used to create cordage. Now, in most cases, when cordage is made from the fibers of a plant, you strip away the outer bark, or the bast of the fibers, in order to get the useful material, which is maybe one or two layers underneath that outer bark. Now once you've harvested that, in many cases, you would begin to clean it in order to make sure that it doesn't have any weaknesses, and you're using as much of the strength of that natural material as you can get from it. In the case of these boards, what you would do is you would take the individual fibers that you're getting out of that plant and putting them across the top and letting them run down the side. Once you've done that, you begin to scrape using other special materials, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, that would help you to clean the fibers. For example, when cleaning a plant that we call hau, you will often do this until all the vale, which is all the slime and all the material that builds up in the fibers of the plant itself, begins to diminish. Using clean water and using a very special tool that we call a kahi here in Hawaii. We have some examples of kahi right here near the top of the case that are made from another auspicious material. We call it pa or papawa. It is pearl shell. And what you might notice about those pieces of pearl shell is they are lashed to handles. Those handles themselves are made often from the outer husk, not of the coconut, but of the coconut leaf. And it provides a soft but sturdy grip. And what you would do is hold on to that part of the kahi and use a flattened, almost edge-like section of the pearl shell to scrape along the surface of the board, which then begins to clean all the fibers. So all of that slime, all that vale comes off, and you begin to get really nice, really uniform pieces to work with. Now once you've done all that cleaning, you take the fibers away from the board, set them somewhere to dry, and when they're appropriately dry, you begin the process of turning them into rope. But before we get into that, what I'd like to show you folks too is one example of a kahi, of a kind of scraper that is not made of pearl shell. Looking back at the case, there's a long, thin piece of bone. And this is a kind of bone that comes from a special animal that we see here in Hawaii and other parts of the Pacific. This is the bone from the underside of a turtle's shell. You can tell from the long shape that it would certainly fit underneath that kuahonu, underneath that shell. And these would be harvested and used in order to create those kahi because they have a natural curve that fits well in the hand. And if you look towards the end, by the number 5, you also see the edge that has been sharpened. And this is essentially what you want to do with these kahi. You want to make them not quite to a sharp chisel point, but that same angle is what's going to be the most useful in scraping against the surface of the board, which is usually flat, and getting the most cleanliness out of that particular action. Now, plants like hau, or another plant that we have that we'll talk about in just a minute called olona, are often processed in this way because the fibers are taken from raw bark. Before you do that, there are alternatives that you can also explore. For example, hau, which many people still use to this day, can be taken from a fresh branch, in which case you would cut a slit down the bark, peel it off very carefully. In some cases, you can leave it in a bucket or leave it in a place with water, and that water will begin to do the process of cleaning for you. Now, if you got it in a bucket, you want to change it because that water will begin to not smell so great. But essentially what you're doing is allowing the plant to lose the fibers that are not strong and retain the things that will be strong, which you will then make into cordage. Take that out, clean it exactly in the same way with the board and the kahi, and you can prepare your fibers in that way. But there are other plants that we might use that don't take the fibers from the bark. They take the fibers from the husk. Down here, by the number 12, we have an example of kaula, aho, different kinds of words for cordage, that is made from the niu, the coconut. Now in Hawaiian, this special kind of cordage has its own name. We call it aha. So like I mentioned before, aha, kafa, afa, these are all names found in parts of the Pacific, and they relate to the fact that the niu, that coconut plant, is so specialized and so useful that because it's found so many places in so many parts of the Pacific, many Pacific Island cultures continue to use them, even to this day. Now looking at the detail of that aha, you might also notice that it's not rope that's been spun. We'll get into that twisting, spinning technique in a moment. But it's rope that has been braided. In fact, some of you folks who might have longer hair, like myself, might be familiar with that herringbone style. And that is created by taking usually odd pieces of cordage and simply folding them into what is essentially a loose knot in the center. That creates that characteristic V shape and is often done with an odd number of fibers. So starting with 3 on one side and 2 on the other side, or as you can get the point. But particularly, they make for this wonderful pattern. And you can see that in many kinds of things that are braided, including this cordage here, which is made from that hau plant. Now, instead of being processed to a very fine point, this hau has been rough processed, so the fibers are much thicker, they're much wider, but that means that you're not spending as much time to create it. So particularly, fibers like this could be used to latch together a house, or to latch together some kind of large wooden structure that you don't need a really fine quality cord for, because it's going to handle all of the tough stuff. But when we talk about fine quality cords, there's one plant here in Hawaii that has no equal. It's endemic to our islands, and it is what we call olona. Olona, known by its scientific name Tachardia latifolia, is an endemic kind of growing plant, sometimes grows like a bush, but it was so special to our kupuna, our ancestors here, that they took great care to cultivate it. Now, there are many different kinds of plants in the Hawaiian Islands that don't need to be cultivated, they grow naturally. But what you would find with olona is often there would be stands of it growing in certain parts of the environment. And instead of trying to pull seedlings and plant them in places where it would be convenient for us as humans to grow them, often the olona was so well established in certain places that they would just weed around it and make a clearing. And in certain cases, these areas where the olona stands would be could be hundreds of feet wide. And that was because the olona plant itself was so special, because it was one of the strongest natural fibers that was available here in Hawaii. It's often said to be the second strongest natural fiber known to people, edged out by another plant called reimi, which comes from Southeast Asia. But olona was so special that it could be used for fishing line, it could be used for the netting that holds fish, the netting that goes into creating feather capes, even special kinds of implements like this kupe. Right over here, we can see the backing of this musical instrument, which has been created using the teeth of ilio, dogs, and olona cordage. And the wonderful thing about olona is it can be made into such a fine fiber that it's the kind of thing you can use to sew together very tiny nets. It's the kind of thing that can be pushed through very small holes and retain all of its strength. So olona was useful in almost all areas of Hawaiian society. So it was very highly prized, and in fact in many cases what you would find is that olona would be grown specifically, and in certain parts of the islands it could be used as a let's say a payment to the ali'i during certain periods of the year where they would collect resources from the districts that they would pass through, or the districts that they had some kind of supervision over. But something else that's really neat about olona is when other cultures begin to come to Hawaii and they get a taste of what we have here, huge balls of olona, like the one that we have down here, could be used for barter and trade. In fact, what Western sailors would find is that certain kinds of hemp and other kinds of rope that they would bring with them on their ships might degrade during their journeys. But when they would come to Hawaii, they would trade for olona because they knew its reputation for being one of the strongest, one of the most useful, and perhaps one of the best cordages known to man. But these are all examples that come from the natural world around us, that come from plants. There's another kind of cordage that's in here that actually comes from us as human beings. If you look very carefully in this case, it's the one type of cordage that really is a very different color than all the others. Now some of you may be able to tell that it's a very dark color, almost black. And that's because this kind of aho, this kind of cordage, is not made from a plant. It's not made from a material that grows in the ground. It's made from a material that grows from us as human beings. It is made from lauoho, from human hair. Now this kind of cordage is not the cordage you would use to lash together a canoe, or to put together a house, or to put together your tools. Instead, this cordage is the kind of thing that would be used for ali'i, for chiefs, or perhaps for kahuna, perhaps for very important people. Because in Hawaiian culture, parts of your body, like your hair, your fingernails, your bones, even your teeth, are considered to be very powerful. They hold on to some of your mana, some of that spiritual energy, that authority. So to use those things to create a physical object, it's very symbolic. And that particular object, well, has a function, because it's rope, it's cordage, it's going to tie, or it's going to hold something, is not the kind of thing that everybody gets to use. In fact, some of the best examples of hair cordage that we have here in the museum, whether it's Hawaiian or from other parts of the Pacific, are always used for objects that are highly prized and owned by chiefs. In Hawaiian Hall, for example, you would see some of the best examples of hair cordage used to make the leiniho palaua, which is that royal symbol of an ali'i. The whale tooth that's been carved into what some people say is the shape of a tongue, suspended on a really amazing necklace made out of human hair. And these would be things that only high chiefs would be allowed to wear and would be so prized that they could be fought over. In fact, these are things that were so valuable that really few people had them at one point in time in Hawaii, particularly when we speak of the ali'i. But when we talk about cordage, as we see here in this case, there are many different examples of their applications, including our kupe'e, our musical instrument that is worn around the knee during hula. We also see different kinds of netting. Particularly, this example here is a koko. And a koko is a kind of net that is used to hold what some people would call a calabash or a bowl, what we might call an umeke. And this particular koko, you might be able to tell, has been made using different kinds of kaula, different kinds of fibers. The darker color is definitely what we would call aha, that's that coconut cordage. And it may have been dyed in a special mixture of muds or other kinds of plant dyes. But what's really neat is you can see the tiers, you can see the color differences between the different parts of the net. On the lower end you have the brown, which looks much more natural to the aha, to that coconut cordage. As you go up, you can see that it has been dyed, it has been colored, and even as you go further, a much lighter, much more bleached out color. And all of these things can be achieved with practice and with the knowledge that goes into creating things like aho and kaula. And that knowledge is also important in understanding how this material and these resources bind together the Hawaiian universe, because without them, well, there'd be a lot of things that wouldn't be wouldn't be set together. But as our time now together is ready to be concluded, I would like to thank you all for joining us today for our WāKahiko Wednesdays. Tune in next week, same time, same place, for another really amazing fact and another amazing presentation from us here at the BishopMuseum BishopMuseum. And like we say, it's never goodbye, it's always that we'll see you again. So, ahuiho, malama pono.